Hi, welcome to another edition of Ask Andrew. Each week I answer a film-related question submitted by one of you, our BMFI patrons. This week's question comes from Jerry, who asks, what led to the creation of the MPAA's movie rating system? How did a film's rating affect its release reception? Is a film's rating still important in today's landscape? Well, the Hollywood Trade Organization, the Motion Picture Association of America, I believe they've now dropped the America. In any case, implemented a rating system, technically called the Classification and Ratings Administration, on November 1st, 1968. And they did that after about 34 years of a self-censorship regime known as the Production Code. And that was basically a set of rules brought about by social pressure in the 20s and early 30s that dictated that Hollywood movies would not show certain acts, certain behaviors, certain body parts, use certain words, and also wouldn't show certain degrees or types of things that were considered to be immoral during those times. Of course, American culture changed a great deal between 1934 and 1968, and really starting in the 1950s when, among other things, television really picked up steam and European art cinema started being shown more widely in the US, Hollywood felt pressure to broaden the range of things that could be depicted in its movies. And that pressure didn't abate. It kept building over the course of the 1950s and into the 1960s until finally the industry was pretty much rebelling against itself. Studios, which were signatories to the code and members of the MPAA, were releasing movies that didn't comply to the code because they had stories they wanted to tell, they had properties that they wanted to turn into films, they had audiences they wanted to reach, they had European films they wanted to compete with, and they had filmmakers they wanted to employ who wanted to tell stories in certain ways. And all of these pressures led to Hollywood abandoning what had for those decades been basically a one-size-fits-all rule, meaning that every movie that they release, regardless of the genre, regardless of the source material, regardless even of who it was intended for, because frankly, they kind of thought all people should want to see all of their movies, and there was a time when that was largely the case, though it was long gone by the 1960s, that's why there was a production code, because all movies could comply with the same set of rules. But that wasn't American society anymore, that wasn't the film industry anymore, and that wasn't the audience anymore. So they implemented a version of the rating system that is not that different. It's actually pretty similar to what we have today, with two major exceptions. One, there was no PG-13 or PG-13 equivalent. That came about in 1984, I believe. And there was a viable X rating, meaning simply that there were no circumstances under which a minor should see the movie, as opposed to an R rating, which meant a minor could see it if their parent or guardian went with them and thought it was okay for them to see. And the X rating stuck around as a viable option for the first few years of the rating system's existence. As many of you know, in 1969, Midnight Cowboy received an X rating and won Best Picture. It was seen as quite legitimate. But in terms of the ratings more generally affecting a film's reception, in some ways it tells you what sort of movie it's going to be, right? If an adventure movie has an R rating, I know there's probably going to be a lot more violence and gore in it than if it has a PG rating. This isn't always the case. There are instances where people try to change their film to get a certain rating. Usually that has to do with cutting things so the movie will get an R rating because most filmmakers are contractually obligated to deliver a film with a rating no higher than an R. And in many cases, a film has to receive a PG-13 if it's a superhero film or some sort of broad franchise film like that. And so changes may have to be made in that regard. I've actually even read about one instance where a rating was changed to make the rating older. I read at one point George Lucas was concerned that Star Wars, the first Star Wars film, was going to get a G rating. And he thought that would be the kiss of death because everyone would think it would be just a kid's movie, and he wanted everybody to see it and he wanted everybody to enjoy it. And he thought there were some things that adults and fans of sort of, science fiction and mythology more broadly would enjoy. So he actually added more shooting and more laser gun fights and more lightsaber fights and things like that to make sure the film got a PG rating, which was important to him. So it can affect a film's perception in that regard. It is still important today because even though it doesn't seem to be enforced so strictly, either by some theaters, or by families, an R rating still technically means that kids shouldn't go see the movie without an adult. And so it's going to be rare that a hugely budgeted film, whether it's a superhero film or science fiction film or what have you, is going to get an R rating, because that necessarily limits a section of the audience. That was changed a bit by the success of the Deadpool movies. But by and large, if a movie really has to, or is expected to, or is designed to truly clean up at the box office, it's going to have a PG or probably PG-13 rating. And so in that regard, they're still important. But I would say ratings probably aren't as important as they used to. When a film wasn't rated, a lot of times people in the early days took it as a sign of a lack of quality, or that it was a relatively obscure movie because it costs money to have your film submitted for rating. And that sometimes said to people that it was a low budget movie if it wasn't worth doing. But now with so many international films being shown, many of which aren't rated, and of course with movies being made for Netflix and Amazon and all these other places, which unless they're ever released into a theater, don't really have any reason to be rated, I think that stigma in particular has gone away. But they still do matter from an industry perspective, I think, more than a cultural perspective, probably. So I hope that answers your question. And if you have a film-related question you'd like me to answer, please visit the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org, find the Ask Andrew form, and submit your question. Who knows? Maybe next time I'll be answering one of your questions.